First of all, I want to dedicate my talk to my friend Paul Klebnikov. He was the editor of Forbes Russia. He and I worked together at Forbes many years ago, and unfortunately he was murdered here in Moscow on July 9th, 2004. His murderers have not been punished to this day, and I miss Paul enormously, and the world had a great loss when he died. In any case, I am dedicating my talk to him and in his memory. So let us begin. How did medicine get to where it is today? How is it that it became the sovereign, powerful profession that it has? How did it, in a certain sense, collect a great deal of social, economic, and political power? Now, there's a difference here. I should tell you I'm going to be speaking from an American's perspective. In the United States, doctors are the most respected profession in the country. They also have the highest average salary of any particular profession in the United States as well. So they are a very well-respected group of people. How did that come about? Well, what happened is that at the 18th century, humanity finally invented in the West the scientific method. And doctors started applying the scientific method of experimentation, of replication, and verification. And doctors began to figure out how things worked for the first time. Prior to that, it was an era, if you will, of rattles and beads and bearskins and stone axes. And essentially, if you went to a healer, they probably did more harm for you than good. So things got improving. So what happened is that doctors began to gain prestige as they invented new technologies. In this particular case is a picture of the first treatment using anesthesia. The guy on the table had a compound fracture, a broken leg, and it was set while he was under anesthesia. And that was the first time, it was 1846. Interestingly, the way doctors came upon anesthesia for the first time is that people had invented nitrous oxide, which is called laughing gas, which dentists use today to anesthetize their patients, and also ether. And interestingly, the doctors were using it as a recreational drug. They were having parties, getting stoned, using nitrous oxide. And one of them came out of one of his stone things and went, what if this worked on my patients? And using the experimental method, one doctor, in fact, went to a patient who was going to have a tooth extracted and said, breathe this. He pulled the tooth out and the guy didn't notice. History was made. But this was a great advance because before that, you can't imagine surgery taking place without anesthesia today. You would have to tie people down and so forth. So this was something that people thought was a great advance, and credit to the doctors. Now, this man is a true hero, Louis Pasteur. He is a great experimentalist. He discovered the germ theory of disease. Interestingly, microorganisms had been discovered 2 centuries earlier by a Dutch lens grinder named Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He was the first person to invent the microscope. He turned his microscope onto pond water, his own blood, those kinds of things, and he found little creatures running around in these substances. And it was the first time that any human being had ever realized that. He submitted his results to the Royal Society, which is the chief scientific society in Britain, and they rejected it. They said, that can't possibly be true. They ridiculed him. They were very skeptical. So to prove it, they arranged to have a committee of Lutheran pastors, preachers, and members of the Royal Society come over and take a look through his microscope. 4 years later, he was elected as a member of the Royal Society. Experiments worked. But the amazing thing about my species is it took another 2 centuries for people to go, I wonder what these things are doing out there. What are they doing to people? And it was Louis Pasteur who figured that out with the germ theory of disease. The particular painting, this example of the painting, is one of his most famous experiments, where he proved that microorganisms did not come into spontaneous generation. They were not just generated out of nothing. And what he did in this particular example is he took flasks, he sealed them up, he boiled the water in them, he took one flask, set it aside, he took another flask, opened the top of it, and left it open to the air, and guess which one eventually had things growing in it? It was the flask that was open to the air. He thus began to prove that germs were out there, they were not spontaneously generated, And then he started linking them, pathogens, particular germs, to particular diseases over time. He proved that for a lot of infectious diseases like cholera, whooping cough, typhoid, and so forth, that were actual microorganisms that were causing it. So this was a great advance as well. Doctors, again, are helping people to understand what it is about their world that's occurring. And then this is Joseph Lister. He invented antisepsis eventually. He's credited with it. Joseph Lister actually read the work that Pasteur had with the germ theory of disease and decided maybe these microorganisms are in fact very, very dangerous. Over here you can see they're doing anesthesia, which they've been doing now for 2 decades at this point. And then here he's spraying the surgical incision with carbolic acid to keep down microorganisms. And this dramatically improved the results of surgery. Typically, people would have surgery or an amputation or something like that in the 19th century. Over half of them would die of infection. And this was a huge advance. So again, doctors are helping people, and they're getting more and more social credit, if you will, because they are coming through with all kinds of new things that were dramatically improving the outcomes of their treatments. When this all occurred, now the doctors have decided we're professionals. We know how to do things better. And again, I'm going to be speaking in an American context. So what happens is that they decide to organize, if you will. They would create their own professional organization, if you will, a doctors' union. The year the American Medical Association was created was in 1847, and this is a letter. I won't read it all or anything like that, but basically what the letter is doing is saying the reason we need to organize is that there are all these other people out there practicing these things they're calling medicine. They're midwives, they're homeopaths, they're chiropractors, they're makers of patent medicines and so forth, and they're out-competing us. What we really need to do is to create our own organization with very high standards, of course, and that way we can exclude all these other people. So they create this organization for the purpose of professionalization and high standards. Let's say that they did think they were going to do that, but they were also going to make sure they got paid well for their high standards. How did they gain social power? How did they do it? And again, it was because of all these things that were going on. So I'm going to go through several case studies of how doctors gained and used their social power. In the United States, abortion was legal in every state in the beginning of the 19th century. And typically, abortion was accepted in most places at the time up until about 2 to 3 months of pregnancy, when the woman could start feeling the baby move around. And it was just called quickening. And before that, you know, it was looked down upon. It wasn't considered to be the best thing you could do, but it was certainly not illegal. The state had no role in deciding what was going to happen. And so it was advertised. You find advertisements in newspapers, for example. This is an advertisement for what are called pennyroyal pills. Pennyroyal is an herb that grows here in Europe. And it can cause abortions if you take the pills. It's very, very dangerous, though. We now have much safer pills, and we can perhaps talk about that and how that liberates people as well. What happens is in 1859, the newly formed American Medical Association, this guy is a guy named Horatio Storer, who was a member of the AMA, decided that we should criminalize abortion in the United States. We should make it illegal to occur. And he was doing it for a couple of reasons. One is that the newly professionalized doctors had taken the Hippocratic Oath from the ancient Greek doctor Hippocrates, and that oath, among many other things, says that you will not perform abortions. So they were holding that as a professional standard. But two is that the United States is an immigrant culture. Almost all Americans, other than those who are Native Americans, came from somewhere else. And at that particular time, what was happening is there was a huge influx of people from Ireland into the United States, and they were Roman Catholic. The people like Mr. Storer thought of themselves as a Protestant culture, and they were afraid that these Catholics coming from Ireland were going to outbreed all the nice Protestants. And they decided what we had to do was make sure that the Protestant women held up their end of the bargain and not abort their babies and have more babies. So part of it was to gain control of women's bodies for political reasons, if you will. So they began a campaign to outlaw abortion in the United States, and by 1900 it was illegal in all states. I should also mention that contraception of all forms was also illegal in the United States up until essentially the 1940s. Where did prescription power come from? Why did doctors have the right to tell you what drugs you can have access to? Well, in the United States, and probably most of the rest of the world, up until the beginning of the 20th century, it was perfectly legal for you to take any substance that you wanted to and put it in your body. It might not be a good idea to do it, but it was perfectly okay and legal for the government would not stop you from doing it. In fact, what happens here is cocaine was derived in 1859 by a German chemist named Nyman for the first time from coca leaves. And heroin was devised by a British chemist by the name of Adler in 1874. And in 1895, the Bayer company in Germany decided to make it into an analgesic, a painkiller. And they sold it over the counter. You could just walk up to your drugstore and say, I would like some heroin, please. And they would hand it to you. And there was no problem with that. Well, except that some of the people who were running, if you will, the state powers were afraid that people were becoming too stoned, they weren't working as hard as they might, there was danger, and doctors had invented this idea called addiction at the time, that what was a vice, this is another way to think about it. A lot of what is happening is that, with medicine is there were a lot of things that were vices, that were bad things, right? They were now transmitted, they were transformed into illnesses, diseases. So drinking too much is now alcoholism. It's a disease, not something that was a vice, among other things. So this was going on, and this problem is that, as it turned out, a lot of American women were using heroin. They enjoyed it. And this was bothering the powers that be, and the doctors were completely on board with that. So what happens? In 1914, the U.S. Congress passes the Harrison Narcotics Act. It didn't outlaw heroin and cocaine. What it did was say only doctors can give it to you, and they can only give it to you if they think you need it for some reason. And so this was the first time prescription power was offered to doctors in history, actually, that was mandated to do this. And they had to have a certificate like that, allowing them to dispense this kind of thing. It was given only to doctors. No other practitioners had access to this. No chiropractors, no midwives, nobody but the doctors did. I would argue that this is the first salvo in the war on drugs, the global war on drugs that we've been fighting for nearly a century now. That is, because what happens is that in the United States and across the world, more and more substances go under this control, under this prohibition, as it were. There are two ways to think about it. One is that there are recreational drugs that your government doesn't want you to have, and then there are also therapeutic drugs that the doctors now are the gatekeepers for. And the doctors want to be the gatekeepers for this because that means you have to come to them and pay them to get the privilege to get the drugs. Again, of course, they would argue we're monitoring you and making sure you're getting the right therapies and so forth, but never forget they are also having the power at the same time that they're doing this. So, on the war on drugs, I'm quite an anti-prohibitionist. I will point out the United States has spent, and I've looked this up, $1 trillion since 1970 fighting the war on drugs. We have no fewer addicts than we had before. No fewer users of these drugs than we had before. The price has not gone up one little bit. We've managed to destroy several Latin American countries, Mexico, Colombia, and several Central American countries because of our drug war, and it's completely nuts. We also incarcerate a higher percentage of our population than any other country in the world, and a huge percentage of that is because of the war on drugs. And it's all started with, if you will, physician power. Eugenics. Scientific eugenics. Eugenics was a term invented by Francis Galton, who was a statistician, a British statistician in the late 19th century. Meaning good, and genics meaning good genes. And he had a notion that because we now had a way of understanding how people inherited characteristics and so forth, though we really didn't have a very good understanding at the time, that we could create, if we were very clever, a race of very gifted people. And one of the ways that you might do that would be to get rid of the not so gifted people, the people who are undesirable. And so this guy, Harry Clay Sharp, was an American physician. He was the chief physician of basically a prison called the Indiana Reformatory. And in 1902, he was the first person to sterilize prisoners against their will on the grounds that they were likely to have children that had undesirable characteristics. And he wrote this letter to the New York Medical Journal saying that we have to do this. In 1907, Indiana was the first state to pass a compulsory eugenics law, basically saying, yes, doctors running these institutions can decide to sterilize people if they think that they're likely to pass on undesirable characteristics. This is a terrible feature of American history. Eventually, some 30 states passed these laws, and about 60,000 Americans over the course of the 20th century were sterilized under these laws. It is a crime. But it was, again, the best scientific medicine, the best thinking of the physicians of the time. This is how we're going to make a better, healthier population. In this particular case, another more additional and more horrible tragedy is that America's eugenics laws attracted the attention of a gentleman by the name of Adolf Hitler. And they adopted laws which they explicitly modeled on American eugenics laws. But Germans, being Germans, not that some of my best friends are Germans, they are very enthusiastic when they start down something. And so what happened is that between 1934 and 1945, 350,000 people in Germany were sterilized under the new eugenic laws. And of course, there was a following-on consequence of the Holocaust that came out of that as well. In any case, this is the notion of eugenics, and these are the states that had various versions of eugenic laws. Homosexuality. It is quite true that most cultures have disapproved of homosexuality, but very few of them had criminalized it up until 19th century. There's an ebb and flow if you look through the history of this that's going on. But what the doctors contributed to this was, again, that notion of taking a vice and saying that it's an illness. And in this particular case, there are several leading physicians who had worked on this, but a guy named Richard Freihard von Krafft-Ebing wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886, where he was describing homosexuality as a mental illness that was amenable to treatment, that he believed that you could cure people of homosexuality. And to his credit, though, he was very, very strongly against the law that was passed in 1871 in Germany that outlawed and criminally punished homosexuality. What happens over time is the psychiatric profession begins to treat homosexuality as a disease, a mental illness, and define it as such. This particular book came out in 1957 by Dr. Edmund Bergler, and he believed in that book that he had a way of curing people of homosexuality. It was not accepted as just a different kind of sexual expression at the time. In 1968, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual reduced homosexuality to merely sexual deviance, and in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted basically 57 to 37%, I think is about right, that homosexuality should be removed as a mental illness from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. By 1981, the World Health Organization also removed it as a disease. And then, to bring it to these shores, as it were, there's the abuse of psychiatry by the Soviet system at the time. It had been going on and off, and again, it's a vast history of what had happened, but it became extremely popular to do this in the 1970s and 1980s. And again, no one will have this full record at this point. These books detail a great deal about what happened. There were at least 15,000 people who were dissidents, who were put into psychiatric hospitals on the basis that they were suffering from a malady called sluggish schizophrenia. Sluggish schizophrenia exists in no other system other than the Soviet system, and the Soviet system of medicine. And it was characterized by things like pessimism, resistance to authority, malcontentedness. Reform delusions was also a sure indication that you were suffering from sluggish schizophrenia. Interestingly, were probably many more people than the 15,000 whose names are known who had been confined for mental illness. There are lists of perhaps 1 million to 2 million Soviet citizens who were being watched for this and the possibility they might be diagnosed. Those lists, as far as these researchers can find, have been destroyed. So we don't know what happened to those people necessarily. Again, it's an abuse of power, the state working hand in hand with the doctors. This is a pet peeve. This is a problem for me. I am a happy customer of a company called 23andMe, which is a genetic testing company in the United States. Basically what they do is give a genome screening test. They take some saliva, they run it through their analyzers, they look at 1 million different genetic variations known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, basically each different million different base pairs, and compare me to other people and how they differ from me. The genome is vaster than that, but this is the first preliminary way of doing this kind of testing. And I've written several articles about the results that I got out of this. Well, the American Medical Association in 2011 wrote a letter basically saying this should be banned. Ronald Beyli and about 1 million other customers should not have access to this. They should not be able to just go to this company and get that information. They should have to come to us. We're doctors. We know better. And to its discredit, the Food and Drug Administration, which is our drugs regulatory agency, in 2013 sent a letter to 23andMe and said, you have to stop doing this. You can't tell Ronald Beyli any more of this information. And so they were shut down, essentially. Now they do ancestry testing and so forth. But what kind of information am I talking about? This, you really can't see this, but the top 3 things, these are basically what they call health risks. And what they're doing are checking for the presence and absence of variations in my genome that would suggest that I have certain kinds of risks. In this particular case, what they find is that I have, from the genes they can test, which is not all of them, but from the ones they can test, I have double the risk of a condition called atrial fibrillation, which is basically a fluttering of the heart. As far as I know, I've not had an episode yet, but the older you get, the more likely you are to have it. The reason this is a particular problem is that it can form blood clots and give you a stroke. And so I find this information interesting. I would like to know this. But the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and the American Medical Association do not think I should have that information. I have actually discussed it with my doctor, and we're watching it to see if anything happens. Well, the problem right now with these tests, and it's not a problem, it's early days. It's something that we all have to get used to, is handling probabilistic information, is that there are other genes that they don't test for, that they can't test for, that are obviously masking or taking care of or counteracting the effect of the genes that they are testing for. And this is also good information for me to know. And I think that what we shall be doing, and I'll explain a little bit later, is dramatically expanding the amount of genetic information we all share with one another. I'm pretty sure that in the not too distant future, high school sweethearts are going to be testing each other and putting their results up on Facebook. But we'll see. All right, so what's the alternative? How are we going to get out of the medical industrial complex? And basically, we're going to put ourselves in power, and the physicians will become our guides. There will not be the people telling us what to do. We'll be the people telling them what to do. So, very quickly, these are some of the technologies I'm going to talk about. The cognitive computing and medicine. It'll be the best doctor in the house. In fact, that doctor will be here in your pocket as your cell phone, your smartphone. On genetic sharing, I'll be talking about that, and it'll help all of us participating can help identify the roots of diseases and aging. CRISPR gene editing. This is possibly the most amazing new technology to come down the pike. It was discovered 3 years ago by two women researchers, a French researcher named Emmanuelle Charpentier and an American researcher named Jennifer Doudna, and I am positive they will get a Nobel Prize very soon for this. And we'll discuss that a little bit. The medical tricorder. It's a contest now ongoing around the world where they're trying to develop a machine that essentially can point it at you and go, I see you have high blood pressure. Maybe you have a viral infection. We'll see if that works out. Telemedicine, where the doctor can basically do a home visit on your phone, and also constant individual health monitoring. So this is going to be the doctor of the future, the best diagnostician ever. IBM has developed a computer system called Watson, very famously in the United States. I don't know if you was aware of it here. Was designed to win a trivia game, a television trivia game called Jeopardy. And it beat the best players on the planet, hands down. Now they're using the same technology to essentially digest all medical information that's out there. They're having the machine read through or record all of the information in medical journals that they can, and they're also getting it to start to do unstructured information. There's a huge amount of medical information that exists in the files that doctors have, the medical notes that they took of their patients and so forth, and they're going to start digesting that information as well to get correlations out of it. Essentially what will happen is that, and they're beginning to do this, there are very famous cancer centers in the United States, for example, the MD Anderson Center in Houston, Texas, are now using Watson to basically give the test information and the diagnosis information to Watson. Watson goes through all of the studies that it knows that is relevant to your particular kind of cancer and designs and suggests a treatment plan designed for you. It'll also take your genetic information and try to figure out what particular genes are broken with your particular cancer, because cancers work different ways. And then it will suggest to the doctors, why don't you try this for this particular patient, for you? And this is going to become very much more expansive. Another thing you can think about for diagnosis in Watson is that already there are microchips where you can take a drop of your blood, put it on the microchip, and it can diagnose 30 different conditions. In the next year or two, there'll be a chip that can do 300 different conditions. You could just plug the chip into your phone, and it could send the information to your doctor or to Watson, and it will be there, and they could help you do a diagnosis at home. You won't have to go into the office for your diagnosis or for your test. You can do it at home. It will also help match patients to clinical trials and speed drug discovery, because again, if it can go through all of the clinical trial data and all the studies, it can make correlations that not even the smartest doctor will be able to do. Medical information is doubling every 3 years. There are some people who believe, because we're doing so well and so fast now, that the doubling rate for medical information will actually be 73 days by 2020. There's no way the most brilliant doctor could ever keep up with all of that going on. This machine will be able to do that. Again, my favorite thing, sharing genetic information. This is a nonprofit group called the Beacon Project, and it's the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And what they're trying to do is to recruit at least 1 million people to share their genetic information. I have signed up for a project run by George Church, who's a molecular biologist at Harvard, called the 100,000 Genomes Project, where I've agreed that I will share all my genetic information and all my health records, and that any researcher may take a look at them. And this is the CRISPR technology. I won't go into great detail about how it's done, but essentially it's based on the way it turns out that bacteria defend themselves against viral infections. Bacteria get infections. Who knew? What happens is the virus will attack the bacteria, it will break its DNA, and because they will do that, the system knows, we've got to fix it. What this does is exactly a system for identifying any particular point on any gene, one base pair, and you can repair one base pair absolutely precisely. You can turn on a gene, you can turn off a gene, you can turn it up, you can turn it down, and it is with great precision that you can do this. And this is a technology that is almost limitless in its possibilities. The tricorder. I'm told reliably that some of you have heard of the program Star Trek. This is an example of the tricorder that Dr. McCoy carried on the Starship Enterprise, and he basically would point it at people and go, "You've got Aldebaran fever," or something like that, and without touching them. And this, as it is, there are a lot of information technology engineer types, millionaires, who are very interested in this, and they have decided to create the Qualcomm $10 million X Prize. And essentially, there are 10 teams that are competing right now, and the results are supposed to be in at the end of the year. And they are supposed to be able to test any one of these particular core conditions and health vital signs and that kind of thing. So it's like anemia, atrial fibrillation, hepatitis A, tuberculosis, and then also blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, temperature, just by basically pointing it at you. And that would be something, I predict that those kind of functionalities will be in your cell phone very shortly after they've actually created the particular tricorder. And as I say, that should be available by the end of the year, or at least the prototype should be available. And then there's telemedicine. Again, why do I have to go to the doctor if I can hold up my phone and we can have a FaceTime session? And they get, I could, let's say I have a rash. I could go, all right, here, doc, what is that? What is that? Instead of having to trek all the way to the office and go in and he goes, oh, that's nothing. Instead, he could tell me at home by looking on the phone if it's nothing or not. And more of this is going on finally. There's a service in the United States. There's also one in the United Kingdom now as well. It's called Doctor on Demand, and it will diagnose these simple things that people often go into the doctor for. This is going on amazingly. There are all kinds of sensors coming along now. I don't know how the Google contacts lens is going, but they were going to have a contact lens that essentially tested your glucose level if you happen to be diabetic. You would just put it in, wear it all the time, and you would be aware of how you were doing with your sugar, essentially your glucose level. But there are lots of other things going on. There are already 14 million of these devices have been deployed, and by the end of 2016, probably 170 million ones. 171 million should be. Then back to the smartphone. Is there anything a smartphone can't do? Anyway, this is the latest thing that Apple announced basically 2 weeks ago. It's called the Research Kit. And what it will do is dramatically improve and speed up clinical trials. Right now they have 5 apps that go with it, which basically do the heart, breast cancer, diabetes, asthma, and Parkinson's disease. And people sign up through this, and they get tracked and monitored in clinical trials. And you can download this now, sign up, give permission to participate in the clinical trials. Now, why do you want to do that? Because the more people, one of the biggest expense in getting a drug to market right now, to getting from a good idea to the patient's bedside, is the process of getting through clinical trials. This is the process of getting drugs to patients, essentially, very schematically. What has happened is this has become enormously expensive. It's the phase 3 trials. The phase 1, you test it basically to see if it works in animals. Phase 2, if it's safe It's in humans, in very small trials, maybe a couple hundred people, and then you get to the efficacy side and you have to try it in thousands of people, potentially, in order to see if it's efficacious and it doesn't have bad side effects. And that costs a lot of money, takes a huge amount of time. You have to go into doctors' offices to sign up. You have to go in to be monitored. It takes forever. And the period of time has grown longer and longer, and therefore more expensive. The good news is that the way modern biology and modern medicine is working now is that we are getting a much better idea of how actual bodies work, how actual cells and tissues work. And by knowing that, we can design drugs much more precisely than we did before. So this clunky process, which is basically an epidemiological process, won't be necessary anymore. One of the problems is that we wait till we get sick to treat it. Now, what if we could instead get out ahead of it? What if we decided, you know what, I don't want to get sick, I want to fix stuff before they break. And this is what I'm calling, if you will, the rejuvenation alternative. As you know, and trust me, I know better now, the older you get, the less likely you are to heal, the more any particular thing is to harm you. You know, when you were young, you sprained your ankle, well, no matter. Trust me, it's not so easy now. Basically, if you're able to rejuvenate people, that is like a massive health breakthrough on every possible level. So is that going to be possible? Well, aging is caused by a bunch of different things, and there are a lot of therapies that are being considered. I'm not endorsing any of them. These are early days, but I think that some of them will work. One of the things that happens as you get older, there are these things called telomeres. The ends of each of your chromosomes in each of your cells has little caps on them, sort of like the caps on the ends of your shoelaces. And when your cells divide, the caps get shorter and shorter. At some point, they disappear. When they disappear, the cell becomes senescent. By senescent, it no longer divides. Senescent cells are very bad for a lot of reasons. Among others is that they also put out proteins and enzymes and so forth that harm other cells, that make them go senescent as well. So what you would like to do is to prevent that process. Now, why do we have the process? It seems to be a way that nature has devised to prevent us from getting cancer after we've reproduced, typically. So basically, what it's doing is telling cells to stop dividing because you're going to get damaged and you're going to turn into a cancer cell. Well, there are now people who are doing research on to figure out if you could use an enzyme called telomerase to re-lengthen the telomeres and to rejuvenate the cells. That could be dangerous. It might actually cause cancer. We don't know. It's early days. But it is something that will probably have to be done at some point in order to overcome aging. Vampires. They knew something, it turned out. The vampires would drink the blood of people and make them perpetually immortal, young. So it turns out there's a bunch of experiments that have been done in the last 10 years, given the name heterochronic parabiosis. Heterochronic means different time. And what the researchers do is they surgically attach an old mouse with a young mouse. They attach them and they share their circulatory system. And what happens is, it turns out, is that some factors in the blood of the young mice rejuvenate the old mice. Do you all have any extra blood out there? Anyway, so it is very well proven. It improves skeletal muscles. It rejuvenates muscles. It rejuvenates neurons. It increases blood flow. It works in mice. Will it work in people? Well, this company is trying it. They just started a clinical trial in California in September, last September. The company's called Alkahest. And what they're doing is they're taking blood plasma from young people, people in their 30s or below, and they are, in fact, transfusing it into the people who are in their 60s who have dementia. And the idea is to see if there is any improvement in their mental capacity over the year that they're going to be doing this. The trial will end this coming October. No one knows if that will work. It does work in mice. We shall see if it works in people. But more interestingly is that researchers at Harvard have identified one of the factors called GDF11, which seems to be the factor that does cause the rejuvenation. And so you could manufacture the GDF, you could either grow it up as a biological or perhaps make it chemically, and then you could give that to people. Those trials will begin in the next 2 years. And I'm going to sign up for that one if they'll let me. Another thing that we know that rejuvenates, or keeps people, it doesn't rejuvenate, it keeps people, or critters, younger, is calorie restriction. These mice are exactly the same age. The difference is that this mouse only got to eat a third of what it wanted to. This one got to eat whatever it wanted to. And I think you can tell a difference. And here you can see the difference. Is these are the mice that eat whatever they want, and these are the ones that eat a third of what they want. The ones who eat a third of what they want live 50% longer. And this happens all the time. I have some acquaintances. I go to meetings of people who call themselves transhumanists. And I have people who are calorie restricted. And they are the skinniest people you will ever meet in your life. And they're so skinny, in fact, that they have to carry pillows to sit on because they have no padding. Anyway, they're hoping that this will keep them alive. I look at them and I'm going, it may not keep you alive, but it'll certainly feel that way. In any case, we don't want to do this. So is it a possibility of figuring out what this pathway is that's activated by calorie restriction and turning it into a pill? Would I be able to take a pill that tells me that my cells, that you're starving to death, please reactivate the pathways that restore and rejuvenate my cells? And there are compounds called sirtuins which apparently do this. Again, they're just beginning clinical trials on this. There's a company called Citrus that's working on this, and their most promising compound is called SRT-1720. And the idea, as you can see, is that it would affect all these particular tissues, and again, make them give you the feeling, or give your cells the feeling that they're starving and thus repairing themselves. CRISPR, again, as you can see, I'm a great CRISPR enthusiast here. This is just an outline of what's possible. It basically, you can integrate any functionality that a gene can do, any functionality, and you can put it precisely where you want it in a gene. It will not disrupt other genes. Or you can silence a gene. If there's a gene that you find doing something bad that you don't want it to do, you can shut it off. And some of the things that are already going on is, in this particular case, is again a mouse experiment. I should always warn you, there's scientists I talk to, the doctors I talk to, the research doctors I talk to, they say, we're great at curing anything in a mouse. It's people we have problems with. But in this particular case, a mouse had a particular genetic defect that failed to make a liver enzyme. It would kill it if it didn't have the enzyme. So what they did was create a vector to basically go into the mouse liver with this one correction to the gene, such that it corrected the liver function in the defective cells. In fact, it corrected in about 30% of the liver cells, but that was enough to rescue the mouse so that it could live a full life. And these are the kinds of therapies we were able to do for someone, for example, who suffers from sickle cell anemia, which is a genetic defect. You should be able, perhaps, to do the same thing with them at some point. Again, we're not at the clinical stage. It's only been 3 years, but it looks very promising. The other thing is about cancer cells. This is a very schematic, but in fact, last week, an Australian team basically cured lymphoma by doing exactly this. They took a CRISPR construct and killed the gene that a cancer cell needs to live. It's a gene called MCL1. And they basically shut it off, and the cells became normal. Again, early days, but amazing possibilities. And stem cells, there's a joke about them now. They've been around for about 20 years, and so far they've not been used very much in a lot of therapies, or at least not legitimate therapies. But again, this is a possible pathway to basically creating cells that are identical to my own, rejuvenating them, and then restoring broken tissues or aged tissues with fresh new cells by infusing them and doing that. There are two ways to get them from embryos. And what you would do is essentially take one of my skin cells, put it into a human egg that has no nucleus anymore, jumpstart it in a petri dish. It turns into 100 cells, take a few of those, and start growing them out, and then transform them into the tissues I might need. And then, more interestingly right now, is what are called induced pluripotent stem cells, where basically you can take that same skin cell, and you don't have to put it in an egg anymore. Because of the research was done on embryonic stem cells, the scientists now know the 4 compounds you need to just dose a skin cell with to make it become a stem cell again, and it can start differentiating again into various tissues. There is some progress on this, but it's a lot slower because one of the problems is that when you do this, some of them become uncontrolled. They become cancer, so you have to be very careful with them at this point. But there are becoming better ways of identifying the ones that are controlled and uncontrolled. And so these are some of the things that stem cells might treat: rheumatoid arthritis, blindness, deafness, muscular dystrophy. They could replace the lost pancreatic cells that cause diabetes, for example. So, at the end here, I think that we are going to dramatically shift the landscape. I was asked by someone earlier today about what I'm thinking we're going to see. I think in 10 years, I know this is always what people say, but I think in 10 years, people will notice a very big shift in the way medicine is practiced. It's not going to be an automatic revolution, but doctors will become more guides. They will become more counselors than they are orderers of your health life. As I say, you will be telling them what to do. They will not be telling you what to do. And finally, an advertisement for myself. This is my book on genetics, Liberation Biology, the Scientific and Moral Case for the Biotech Revolution. It's been out some time now. It is available on Amazon. This one is my new book. It's a completely different topic, and I would love to be invited back to talk about that at some point. It's coming out in July. It will be published by St. Martin's Press in July 21st. Anyway, I really thank you for your attention. I hope that it wasn't too rambling, and I'm eager to listen to any questions you all might have. Thank you very much.
As I see it, giving these diagnosis tools to the people, isn't it a big risk because they are not 100% perfect, and we can have this risk of wrong decisions made by this, as you right said, the magic box. And how risky is this?
Again, that is a risk, obviously. But think about it this way. In the United States, I don't know what the arrows would be here, something like 20% of patients are harmed in the hospital by bad prescriptions. That simply the people running the prescription system get it wrong. And computers are now being used to improve that rate of things. So people make mistakes, and so we don't think we have some better system now that's doing it. What these will be incremental improvements over time. One of the other things that I think will happen is that we will have interpreters. We'll have special new people, professions that we don't know what to call them, that essentially will be able to interface with these machines, the computers, for example, or the diagnostic microchips or whatever, and they will be able to help you or me figure out what's going on. And they will be, if you will, the human interface between these technologies. There won't be doctors, though. They will be very specifically trained to interact with these technologies. One of the things I find frightening to me, and I'm the sort of person who interviews my doctors before I decide I'll let them treat me. And so what I find extremely frightening is that a lot of doctors do not understand genetic medicine at all. And they don't want to understand it. So what will happen is we will have to create a profession between them who can translate between them and us about that kind of information. So what will happen is an elaboration of counselors that will help us navigate these kind of technologies.